I'm excited what God is doing here at Church at the Well. I was here when Church at the Well, the opening service, and it's great to see how God is blessing this faith community. I understand you all are in a sermon series, the greatest summer ever. Everybody having a great summer? And today we're talking about the theme, the greatest servant. And I gave this sermon a title. I struggle with the title a little bit, but it's called An Upright Position. Now, as we were seating and making sure we were sitting up, I hope my comments don't contradict our posture, and you'll understand as I get into the message. And I'm going to be reading from Luke, the 22nd chapter, verses 24 through 30. And I also just want to thank Pastor Jamaica and Gene are great friends of ours. I also want to just thank my wife and my two boys for joining me this morning. I hope I do, just for a brief moment, have their attention as well. Amen. Beginning at the 24th verse. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is greater? One who reclines at table, or one who serves? For who is the greater? The one who reclines at table, or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves. You are those who have stayed with me in my trials, and I assign to you, as my Father assigned to me, a kingdom, that ye may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. We enter this story with a major question before us. Who is the greatest? Much like the barbershop banter I experienced of my youth, there's this passionate dispute taking place, except this debate isn't about football, basketball, Montana or Brady, LeBron or Jordan. This is a different type of debate. The 12 disciples are debating who's the greatest. Now, it's interesting. They're at the table during this debate, and Jesus is giving his farewell discourse. He's letting them know, I'm going away. And Jesus has begun his farewell discourse and instituted what we as believers observe as the Lord's Supper. How fitting that we find ourselves at the table. The offering of broken bread and cup, and Jesus is about to offer himself up upon a cross. This serves as an appropriate backdrop for this lesson. Who is the greatest? You know, the Lord's Supper serves as a reminder that Jesus makes himself known through the breaking of bread. Now, we find meals taking place throughout the Bible. Theologians Matt Crossman and Miroslav Volf point out that the table can be understood as a site of nourishing mutual encounters with God, family, neighbors, friends, and even foes. You know, the Lord prepares a table in the presence of our enemies. And as the disciples drink from the cup, Jesus announces to them that someone at the table, the table is going to betray him. And for context, Luke places this lesson on greatness between betrayal and an eventual denial. Between betrayal and denial. Can we learn something about greatness in these in-between moments? Even our most difficult moments, betrayal and denial. But as this conversation is taking place, and as many of us might be prone, we were trying to capture our attention it almost seems as in their debating, and I don't know what debates you have in your life, but in their debating, the disciples even almost forget that Jesus is there. How would it be different if we acknowledged and welcomed Jesus at our tables? What would be different if our tables were not divided by worthiness or unworthiness? See, in many ways, the disciples were arguing about worthiness. And even with the knowledge of betrayal and denial, we find both Judas and Peter, the denier, at that table. As with Jesus, so many times he turns things upside down and responds in the way that confounds even the wise. Now, as the disciples tried to make sense of all of what Jesus was talking about, in many ways, they were holding on to old ideas. The disciples had a messianic expectation of Jesus that he would restore them to a place of power and status. See, this is why he makes a reference to the Gentile leadership. It's an opportunity to contrast how society was defining greatness and how Jesus was defining greatness. Benefactors were a class of people with power and pedigree who celebrated themselves for it. They read their own press releases. They were the people that were born on third base but pretended they hit a home run and congratulated themselves for it. Those were the benefactors. The power that the benefactors possessed was not worthy of honor or perceived as greatness, even though they thought they were being great. So the disciples would understand Jesus' reference. And in the same way he uses this juxtaposition of Gentile leadership, he also likens the greatest to being the youngest. Now, I'm the youngest of three boys, so I understand a little bit about being the youngest. And the disciples would understand that age determined rank, and often the youngest received the least amount of respect. Now, we'll talk about that later, and would be the one in the family that was fulfilling menial duties. Just consider David. David was the youngest of Jesse's 12. And when Samuel came to anoint the new king of Israel, David wasn't present. Samuel had to ask Jesse, "Are these all your sons?" Only to discover that the youngest David was not invited, was out tending sheep. Now, this lesson is about being the greatest servant, but I need to make some comments about servanthood and what it means to be a servant. And I want to clarify what I don't mean when I talk about being a servant. So many businesses, politicians, organizations, even churches like to talk about serving. And they have this concept of servant leadership. And I'm not against servant leadership or the term, but often when I see it in action, it's pretty lackluster. Just to push this point a little further, there's a journalist and author, Anand Giridharadas, and he challenges us not to look at service as simply being nice or expressing generosity. Here he argues, and these are his words, "For generosity is a win-win, but justice often is not. The winners of our age, the benefactors of our age, don't enjoy the idea that some of them might actually have to lose. They might actually have to sacrifice for justice to be done." Now, I don't believe that you can serve well without sacrifice. As Christians, we should fully embrace this because our entire faith is built upon a sacrifice. And then I want to tell you a story about one of my favorite theologians, Howard Thurman. And he tells this story about his grandmother. And they used to read the Bible together. Now, his grandmother was born a slave. And she lived until the Civil War on a plantation, in all places past Jamaica in Florida. He would read her Bible. He would read the Bible with her. But she never wanted to read the Pauline epistles. And then after 10 years, he says, "You know what, Grandma, why don't you want to read the Pauline epistles?" And her answer was startling. This is what she says, and she states, "During the days of slavery, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves or servants. Always the white minister uses his text, something from Paul. At least 3 or 4 times a year, he used to use a text, slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters, as unto Christ. Then he would go on to show how it was God's will that we were slaves, and how if we were good and happy slaves, good and happy servants, God would bless us. Now, I don't know if you all have experienced that extent of misuse of servanthood, but I am sensitive that authority is often abused, and master-slave relationships do not honor the humanity in all of us. We ought to challenge those notions and not promote them. They're problematic. And when people try to encourage you to be a servant only to abuse you, you need to push back on that. But for who is the greater? One who reclines at a table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you the one who serves. Do you see who's reclining at the table? The one being served reclines, leading me to believe that the one doing the serving is in an upright position. The one being served seems concerned with comfort, while the one serving may be experiencing discomfort. Could aversion to true service be caused by our habits of seeking comfort? Now, Jesus is reversing our understanding of things here, but not by reclining at the table and waiting to be served, but he remains upright as one who came to be served. Now, Reinhold Niebuhr, another theologian, is said to have adapted words from a humorist, a journalist, Finley Peter Doom. Doom states, "It is the job of the newspapers to comfort the afflicted and inflict the comfortable." Niebuhr used the phrase to describe the mission of Jesus by saying, Jesus came to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Has anyone ever heard that phrase before? This has a paradoxical quality to it. As he chooses to take on the uncomfortable, Jesus is inviting those who will join him in the fellowship of his suffering at his table, in his kingdom. Like the disciples, it may be hard to comprehend that God's promised kingdom is not always experienced in the here and now. You may have to sit up and serve as others recline and demand you to be served, but rest assured that there is promise of a heavenly banquet. There is hope. Come and dine, the master calleth. Come and dine. You may feast at Jesus' table all the time. He who fed the multitude turned the water into wine. To the hungry calleth now, come and dine.